The bullet carved a crimson trail across the starless sky as Matthew Zimmerman pressed his hand against his bleeding shoulder, the pain searing through his body like wildfire in the dry Colorado brush. He'd never expected to find himself wounded and alone, stumbling through the outskirts of Durango as the first light of dawn crept over the distant mountains. The year was 1876, and Matthew had spent the better part of a decade driving cattle across the Western Territories, trading the comfort of a permanent home for the ever-changing landscape of the frontier. His weathered Stetson cast a shadow over his face as he gritted his teeth against the pain, knowing he wouldn't last much longer without help. The bullet lodged in his shoulder sent waves of agony through his chest with each labored step, and the blood loss was making him lightheaded. He spotted a modest homestead in the distance, a small cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, promising warmth and perhaps salvation. With the last of his strength, Matthew urged his weary legs forward, collapsing against the rough-hewn door before his knuckles could complete their third knock. Nora Adams had been awake since before sunrise, tending to her small flock of chickens and preparing for another day of solitude. The harsh knock at her door startled her, breaking the quiet routine she'd carefully constructed in the 18 months since burying her husband. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and approached the door cautiously, the memory of frontier dangers never far from mind. When she pulled the door open, a man tumbled forward at her feet, his blood immediately staining her freshly swept wooden floor. "Sweet mercy," she gasped, kneeling beside the unconscious stranger. His skin was ashen beneath his tan, and the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder told her everything she needed to know. Someone had shot this man, and he wouldn't survive much longer without help. Despite his considerable size, Nora managed to drag him inside, closing the door against the curious eyes of neighbors who might be passing by. She had enough troubles without inviting gossip about taking in strange men. With practiced efficiency, she gathered clean cloths, a basin of water, and the small medical kit her late husband had insisted they keep stocked. Matthew awoke to searing pain and the gentle pressure of unknown hands examining his wound. He jerked upright, regretting the motion instantly as fresh blood pulsed from his shoulder. "Be still," a firm female voice commanded. "You'll undo what little good I've managed to do." His vision cleared enough to focus on the woman leaning over him. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, with honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her green eyes were sharp with concentration as she cut away his bloodied shirt. "The bullet's still in there," she said, not looking up from her work. "I need to get it out before infection sets in." Matthew swallowed hard, the metallic taste of blood lingering on his tongue. "You done this before, madam," her hands stilled momentarily. "My husband was shot during the war. I learned what I needed to." She met his gaze, grief and determination mingling in her expression. "He survived that wound. Whether you survive yours depends on how still you can lie while I dig that bullet out." Without waiting for his response, Nora rose and retrieved a bottle of whiskey from a cupboard. She poured a generous amount into a cup and handed it to him, then splashed some over her hands and the tweezers she'd sterilized in the hearth's flame. "Drink," she instructed. "All of it." Matthew obliged, the liquor burning a path down his throat that momentarily distracted him from the pain in his shoulder. He watched as she threaded a needle with steady hands, laying it aside for later use. "What's your name, Cowboy?" she asked, arranging her tools with the precision of someone trying to delay an unpleasant task. "Matthew Zimmerman," he managed, his voice rough from the whiskey and pain. "Most folks call me Matt." "Well, Mr. Zimmerman, I'm Nora Adams." She positioned herself beside him, tweezers poised above his wound. "And I apologize in advance for this." The pain of her probing for the bullet nearly caused Matthew to pass out again. He gripped the edge of her kitchen table with his good hand until his knuckles turned white, determined not to cry out. She worked in focused silence, her hands steady despite the difficulty of the task. When the tweezers finally emerged holding a misshapen piece of lead, Nora dropped it into a small dish with a soft clink. "That's done," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Now for the stitching." As she prepared to close the wound, Matthew found himself transfixed by her hands. They were not the soft, pampered hands of a city woman, but neither were they as rough as might be expected from someone who worked a frontier homestead alone. They moved with certainty, each motion precise and economical. Despite his pain, he noticed a small scar across her right knuckles and the simple gold band she still wore on her left hand. "You have steady hands, Mrs. Adams," he said, partly to distract himself from the needle now piercing his skin. "Steady enough," she replied, not looking up from her work. "My mother taught me to sew when I was just a girl. Never thought I'd use the skill quite like this." The thread pulled through his flesh, drawing the ragged edges of the wound together. Matthew watched, oddly fascinated by the intimate process of being literally sewn back together by this stranger's capable hands. "How'd you come by this bullet?" Nora asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Matthew hesitated. The truth was complicated and potentially dangerous for anyone involved. "Disagreement with some fellows who didn't care for my company," he said finally. Her eyes flicked to his face, skepticism evident. "Most disagreements don't end with bullets, Mr. Zimmerman." "They do in my line of work, madam." Her hands paused. "And what work is that?" "I drive cattle," he said, which was true enough. He didn't mention that his last herd had been rustled from a ranch whose owner had refused to pay protection money to the Clayton gang, or that he'd been running from the consequences of that decision for 3 days. Nora resumed her stitching, her silence making it clear she knew he wasn't telling the full story. Matthew found himself wishing he could, but involving this widow in his troubles would be poor repayment for her help. As she tied off the last stitch and began bandaging his shoulder, Matthew's exhaustion caught up with him. His eyelids grew heavy, and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Nora Adams washing his blood from her hands, the morning sunlight turning the water in the basin to liquid gold. When Matthew next awoke, the quality of light in the cabin had changed. Golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. He was lying on a narrow bed, covered with a patchwork quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. The pain in his shoulder had dulled to a persistent throb, and his mouth felt as dry as the Colorado Plateau in August. He heard movement and turned to see Nora by the hearth, stirring something in a large pot that filled the cabin with the rich aroma of beef stew. She'd changed her bloodied apron for a clean one, and had loosened her hair so that it hung in a simple braid down her back. The domestic scene struck him with unexpected force. How long had it been since he'd woken in a real home, with someone cooking a meal that wasn't beans over a campfire? "You're awake," Nora observed, glancing over her shoulder. "Thought you might sleep through to tomorrow." Matthew attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his fresh stitches. "How long was I out?" "About 6 hours." She wiped her hands on her apron and approached, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. "No fever yet. That's promising." Her touch was cool against his skin, and Matthew found himself strangely reluctant for her to withdraw it. "I've imposed on your kindness enough, Mrs. Adams. If you could point me toward town, I'll be on my way." Nora's eyebrows rose. "You'll do no such thing. That wound needs rest, and the nearest doctor is in Silverton, almost 30 miles north, unless you're eager to tear those stitches and bleed to death on the trail." There was a pragmatic sensibility to her words that brooked no argument. Matthew settled back against the pillows, recognizing defeat. "I can pay you for your trouble," he offered, suddenly conscious of his status as an uninvited guest in a widow's home. "I didn't help you for money, Mr. Zimmerman." She returned to her cooking, her back straight with a pride that suggested the offer had somehow offended her. "Matt," he corrected. "If I'm to be your patient, you might as well use my Christian name." She was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, Matt. You can earn your keep once you're able. My fence needs mending, and there's always work for a pair of strong hands around a homestead. The casual mention of his hands drew Matthew's attention back to hers as she ladled stew into a bowl. They were capable hands, he thought again, hands that had saved his life just hours before. "I'm obliged to you, Nora," he said, using her given name deliberately, testing the boundary she seemed to be establishing between them. She paused briefly at his familiarity but didn't correct him. Instead, she brought the bowl of stew and helped him sit up enough to eat. The simple meal tasted better than anything Matthew could remember, though whether that was due to his near-death experience or Nora's cooking skills, he couldn't say. As darkness fell, Nora lit oil lamps and prepared a pallet for herself near the hearth, insisting Matthew keep the bed. "It wouldn't be right," he protested. "I can sleep on the floor and undo all my hard work." She shook her head firmly. "I've slept worse places than my own floor, Mr. Matt. This arrangement is temporary." The way she emphasized temporary made it clear she expected him gone as soon as he was healed. Matthew couldn't blame her. A single woman living alone had to be careful about her reputation, especially in a small community like Durango. Despite his discomfort at displacing her from her bed, exhaustion soon pulled Matthew back into sleep. His last conscious thought was of Nora's hands, moving with such purpose as she sewed him back together. The next few days established a routine between them. Nora would tend to her daily chores, feeding chickens, tending her small vegetable garden, preparing meals, and check Matthew's wound twice daily, changing the bandages with the same efficient movements that had first caught his attention. For his part, Matthew grew increasingly restless with inactivity. By the third day, he insisted on at least sitting in a chair by the window, where he could watch Nora working outside and feel less like an invalid. By the fifth day, he was helping with small tasks inside the cabin, though she forbade him from using his injured arm. "Tell me about your husband," Matthew said one evening as they sat by the fire, Nora mending a shirt while he whittled a piece of wood with his good hand. The question had been forming in his mind since he'd first seen the wedding ring she still wore, but it had taken days to find the courage to ask. Nora's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their rhythmic movement with the needle. "Thomas was a good man. We came out here from Pennsylvania after the war. He'd fought for the Union and wanted a fresh start where the memories weren't so thick on the ground." "How long were you married?" 7 years, she said softly. "No children, though not for lack of trying. He took sick with pneumonia winter before last. Doctor couldn't do anything for him." She knotted her thread with a sharp tug. "Been on my own for 18 months now." Matthew nodded, understanding better now the determined self-sufficiency he'd observed in her. "It's not easy making it alone out here." "No," she agreed, "but I manage. This land was our dream and I won't give it up easily." She glanced up at him. "What about you? No wife waiting somewhere, wondering where her husband's gone off to?" Matthew laughed, though the sound held little humor. "No, madam, never stayed in one place long enough to court properly, I suppose." Her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, and that bullet, still maintaining it was just a disagreement, he sighed, setting aside his whittling. The past week of her care had created a debt he couldn't repay with continued lies. "I was driving cattle for a man named Harrison up near Grand Junction. What he didn't tell me was that half the herd was rustled from the Clayton Ranch." Nora's eyes widened. The Clayton Ranch was the largest in the territory, owned by a former Confederate officer with a reputation for ruthlessness. "When I found out, I refused to continue the drive. Harrison didn't take kindly to my change of heart. He and his boys decided to ensure my silence more permanently." Matthew gestured to his shoulder. "I got away with just this, which makes me luckier than I deserve. So you were running when you found my door." "Yes," he admitted, "though I doubt they followed me this far. They probably think I'm dead in a gulch somewhere." Nora was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her sewing. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she finally said. "I appreciate knowing what danger might be on my doorstep. I'll leave as soon as I'm able." Matthew promised, hating how the words tasted in his mouth. "I've brought enough trouble to your life." "No," she said, surprising him. "You made the right choice refusing to continue with stolen cattle. That speaks to your character." She looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "And I could use the help around here, at least until you're fully healed. After that, well, we'll see." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of a connection that had been forming since he'd first opened his eyes to find her tending his wound. Matthew wasn't sure what to call it, this tenuous bridge between two solitary people who'd found each other through violence and necessity, but he knew he wasn't ready to walk away from it just yet. "I'm a fair hand with fences," he offered, "and I can split wood one-armed if need be." The smile that curved Nora's lips was small but genuine. "We'll start with the fence tomorrow then, small sections at a time." That night, as Matthew lay in Nora's bed listening to her steady breathing from her pallet by the hearth, he realized he hadn't thought about moving on in days. The sensation was as foreign as it was frightening, like standing at the edge of a canyon, knowing a single step could lead to either flight or a fatal fall. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of warmth later in the day. True to her word, Nora led Matthew to a section of fence that had fallen into disrepair. She'd already gathered the necessary tools and materials, and together they began the work of replacing rotted posts and mending broken rails. Matthew found he could do more than expected with one good arm, especially with Nora working alongside him. She was stronger than she looked, capable of driving fence posts into the hard Colorado soil with well-placed strikes of a mallet. They worked in companionable silence broken only by occasional instructions or questions, and Matthew found himself stealing glances at her more often than the task required. The morning sun brought a flush to her cheeks and lightened her hair to the color of honey. Without the constraints of her cabin, she moved with a freedom that revealed a vitality he hadn't fully appreciated before. This was a woman who had carved her place in the harsh western landscape through sheer determination, who had faced loss and continued forward without surrendering to despair. By midday, they had completed a respectable section of fence, and Nora called a halt to the work. "You're favoring that shoulder more than you think," she observed, handing him a canteen of water. "We should check the stitches to make sure you haven't pulled any." They retreated to the shade of a large cottonwood tree, where Nora had spread a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. With practiced efficiency, she helped Matthew remove his shirt and examined her handiwork. "They're holding," she pronounced, her fingers gently probing the healing wound. "But we've done enough for today. This will need time." Matthew nodded, acutely aware of her touch on his bare skin. Her hands were warm from work, slightly calloused but infinitely gentle as they rewrapped his shoulder. He watched her face as she concentrated on the task, noting the small furrow between her brows and the way she caught her lower lip between her teeth when focusing intently. "Why did you help me?" he asked suddenly. "You could have left me on your doorstep or sent for the sheriff." Nora's hands paused, then resumed their work. "I couldn't very well leave a bleeding man to die on my threshold," she said practically. "What kind of Christian would that make me?" Many would have, especially a woman alone. She secured the bandage and sat back, considering him with those direct green eyes. "My father was a doctor back in Pennsylvania. He taught me that human life is sacred, regardless of circumstances." A shadow crossed her face. "And I've seen enough death to last a lifetime. I wasn't eager to witness more." Matthew caught her hand before she could withdraw it completely, holding it gently between his own. "Thank you, Nora, not just for saving my life, but for your kindness since." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or an emotion more complex before she carefully extracted her hand from his. "Eat your lunch, Cowboy. We still have the afternoon ahead of us." The moment passed, but Matthew felt its significance lingering between them like the scent of sage after a rain shower, subtle but undeniably present. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of shared work, and gradually increasing comfort in each other's company. Matthew's strength returned steadily, and with it, his ability to contribute meaningfully to the homestead's upkeep. He mended fences, repaired the sagging corner of the barn roof, and split enough firewood to last through the coming winter. Each evening, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in a silence that had become companionable rather than awkward. Matthew told stories of his years driving cattle across the territories, of sunsets over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and flash floods in Arizona's desert canyons. Nora spoke of her life before coming west, of growing up the daughter of a country doctor, of learning to navigate the aftermath of war in a divided community, of meeting Thomas at a church social, and knowing within weeks that he was the man she wanted to build a life with. "You miss Pennsylvania?" Matthew asked one evening as they shelled peas from Nora's garden. She considered the question, her fingers never ceasing their methodical movement. "I miss certain things, the spring blossoms, the familiarity of places I'd known all my life, but this land." She glanced toward the window, where the last light of day painted the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "There's a freedom here I never found back east, room to breathe, to become whoever you choose, even living alone." The question was more personal than he'd intended, and Matthew immediately wished he could recall it, but Nora didn't seem offended. "Even alone," she agreed, "though I won't pretend it isn't difficult sometimes." She looked up at him, her expression unguarded for perhaps the first time since he'd known her. "The silence can be overwhelming." The admission hung between them, fragile as a spider's web glistening with morning dew. Matthew wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, to acknowledge the courage it took to voice such vulnerability, but he feared breaking the delicate moment. Instead, he offered a truth of his own. "I've spent most of my life in the company of men who barely speak except to curse or give orders. I thought I preferred it that way, simple, uncomplicated." He met her gaze steadily. "I'm not so sure anymore." A knock at the door shattered the intimacy of the moment. Nora rose quickly, adjusting her apron with hands that trembled slightly. Matthew tensed, his mind immediately conjuring images of Harrison's men tracking him down, but Nora's relaxed greeting suggested a less threatening visitor. "Evening, Sheriff Miller. What brings you out this way?" The man who entered removed his hat respectfully, revealing graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades under the western sun. His eyes, however, were sharp as they took in Matthew's presence at Nora's table. "Mrs. Adams," he nodded, then turned his attention to Matthew. "Don't believe we've met, stranger." Matthew stood, extending his hand. "Matthew Zimmerman, sir." The sheriff shook his hand with a firm grip, his assessing gaze noting Matthew's still bandaged shoulder visible beneath his partially unbuttoned shirt. "Passing through." "Mr. Zimmerman was injured on the trail," Nora interjected smoothly. "I've been helping him recover before he continues his journey." Sheriff Miller's expression remained neutral, but Matthew detected a hint of disapproval in the way his eyes moved between them. "Mighty generous of you, madam. Though folks might talk, you housing a single man like this." Nora's spine straightened. "I believe the Good Samaritan was more concerned with saving a life than with wagging tongues, Sheriff. As am I." The sheriff had the grace to look chastened. "Of course, madam, no offense meant." He turned back to Matthew. "What brings you to Durango, Mr. Zimmerman? Business or pleasure?" The question seemed casual, but Matthew recognized it for the subtle interrogation it was. "Neither, initially. I was working a cattle drive that ended, prematurely. Found myself in need of a new direction." The sheriff studied him a moment longer. "Well, just so happens I rode out here with a purpose beyond checking on the widow Adams. Got word from up Grand Junction way about some trouble with rustled cattle. Fellow named Harrison claiming one of his drovers stole his money and ran off." He watched Matthew's face carefully. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Matthew felt Nora's eyes on him, knew she was remembering his confession about the cattle drive. He could lie, maintain the story he'd given the sheriff, but the thought of continuing to build his relationship with Nora on a foundation of deception was suddenly intolerable. "I worked for Harrison briefly," he admitted. "Left his employ when I discovered the cattle we were driving had been rustled from the Clayton spread." He met the sheriff's gaze directly. "I didn't steal any money, but I did refuse to continue working for a thief." Sheriff Miller's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. "That's not the story Harrison's telling." "I imagine it isn't," Matthew agreed. "Men like Harrison rarely admit their own wrongdoing. You're calling him a liar. I'm telling you the truth, Sheriff. What you choose to believe is your business." A tense silence filled the cabin. Nora stood very still, her hands clasped tightly before her. Finally, the sheriff sighed, settling his hat back on his head. Clayton himself rode into Grand Junction 2 days after Harrison filed his complaint. Seems his men tracked the rustled cattle to Harrison's property. A hint of a smile touched the lawman's lips. Harrison's cooling his heels in a territorial prison cell now, along with those drovers of his who didn't get away. Relief washed through Matthew so powerfully that he had to brace himself against the table. "So I'm not. There's no warrant." "Not for you, son." The sheriff's eyes crinkled with the wisdom of a man who had seen enough of humanity to recognize honesty when he encountered it. Clayton mentioned a drover who'd refused to continue the drive when he realized the cattle were stolen. Said that man deserved a reward, not a jail cell. Matthew shook his head, still processing this unexpected turn of events. "I don't need a reward. Just knowing Harrison won't be stealing anyone else's livelihood is enough." Sheriff Miller nodded approvingly. "Well, seems you've found yourself a good place to recover from that bullet wound at any rate." He glanced at Nora. "Mrs. Adams has always been known for her charitable nature." "Yes," Matthew agreed, his eyes finding Nora's across the room. "I've been fortunate in that regard." After the sheriff departed with a final warning to be mindful of appearances, Nora closed the door behind him and leaned against it, her expression unreadable. "You told him the truth," she said quietly. "Even when you thought it might mean arrest." Matthew nodded. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "Why?" He considered the question, understanding its importance. "Because I'm tired of running, because the truth, however complicated, is simpler than keeping track of lies." He took a step toward her. "Because I don't want there to be falsehood between us, Nora." Her eyes searched his face, looking for something Matthew hoped she would find. "And what is between us, Matt?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities neither had dared voice until now. Matthew closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if his proximity was unwelcome. She remained still, her gaze steady on his face. "Something I never expected to find," he said softly. "Something that makes me want to stop wandering for the first time in my life." Nora's breath caught audibly. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," Matthew countered. "I know you're brave enough to stitch up a stranger without flinching. I know you're stubborn enough to maintain this homestead alone rather than abandon your dream. I know your hands are strong and gentle, and that when you smile, really smile, not the polite one you use when you're keeping your thoughts to yourself, it feels like sunrise after the longest night." A flush spread across her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "And what about Thomas? You're speaking these words in the home I built with my husband." It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. "I would never ask you to forget him or what you shared," Matthew said carefully. "But I believe there's room in a heart for more than one love. That loving again doesn't diminish what came before." Nora closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they shimmered with unshed tears. "I never expected to feel this way again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It frightens me." Matthew raised his hand to her face, his thumb gently brushing her cheek. "It frightens me too," he confessed. "But some fears are worth facing, don't you think?" The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Then, with a decisiveness that characterized everything about her, Nora closed the remaining distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them cautious in this new territory they were exploring together. Then Matthew's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and the kiss deepened with a sudden hunger that surprised them both. Her hands came up to frame his face, those capable hands that had first caught his attention now holding him with a tenderness that made his heart ache. When they finally parted, breathless and slightly stunned by the intensity of their connection, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably mention," he said, a smile tugging at his lips, "that I'm not actually planning to continue my journey anytime soon, if that's agreeable to you." Nora's answering smile was the real one, the one that transformed her entire face and made his heart stutter in his chest. "I suppose the fence on the north pasture does need replacing," she said, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck. "That could take some time. Months, at least," Matthew agreed solemnly. "And then there's the barn expansion to consider." "Exactly. It would be irresponsible to leave such projects half-finished." Their second kiss was less hesitant than the first, sealed with a promise neither spoke aloud but both understood. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. As summer yielded to autumn in the Colorado highlands, the relationship between Matthew and Nora deepened alongside the changing colors of the aspens. They worked side by side during daylight hours, transforming the homestead with repairs and improvements that had been beyond Nora's ability to manage alone. In the evenings, they sat before the fire, their conversations ranging from childhood memories to hopes for the future, each revelation bringing them closer. Matthew moved his sleeping arrangements to the barn loft, a concession to propriety that neither was entirely happy about but both recognized as necessary. Durango might be a frontier town, but it still maintained certain expectations of conduct, especially for a widow living alone. The first snow fell in late October, dusting the mountain peaks and signaling the approach of a winter that would test their preparations. Matthew had split and stacked enough firewood to last through the coldest months, and Nora's cellar was filled with preserved vegetables from her garden, smoked meat, and staples purchased from town with the money Matthew had insisted on contributing to their household. Their household. The phrase still caught him by surprise, sometimes the notion that he, a man who had spent his adult life drifting from one job to the next, could find such contentment in the routines of a settled existence. Even more surprising was how natural it felt, as though his years of wandering had been merely preparation for finding this place, this woman. "You're staring again," Nora observed one evening, looking up from the shirt she was mending one of his, worn thin at the elbows from hard use. Matthew didn't deny it. He had been watching her hands as they worked, still fascinated by their capable movements. "Just appreciating the view," he said with a smile. A blush colored her cheeks, but she held his gaze with the directness he'd come to cherish. "Sheriff Miller rode by again today while you were checking the fence line," she said, returning to her sewing. "He mentioned that Reverend Thompson is performing a wedding ceremony this Sunday for the Sullivan girl and that blacksmith who came from Denver last spring." Matthew nodded, waiting for her to continue, sensing there was more to this casual observation than mere gossip. "He also mentioned," Nora added, her eyes fixed determinedly on her stitching, "that the Reverend would be happy to perform another ceremony should the occasion arise." The implication was clear, and Matthew felt his heart rate quicken. They had spoken of a future together in vague terms, but neither had broached the specific subject of marriage. The bullet wound in his shoulder had healed weeks ago, leaving only a puckered scar where Nora's neat stitches had closed the torn flesh. There was no practical reason for him to remain at the homestead, no reason except the love that had grown between them, unspoken but undeniable. "Is that something you'd consider?" he asked carefully. "Becoming Mrs. Zimmerman instead of Mrs. Adams?" Nora set her sewing aside, meeting his eyes with a vulnerability that still moved him deeply whenever she allowed it to show. "I've been considering it for some time now," she admitted. But I wasn't sure if you were ready to give up the trail permanently for this. She gestured around them, encompassing the modest cabin and the life they'd been building. Matthew crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her and taking her hands in those hands that had first captured his attention, that had saved his life, and then, gradually, given him a reason to truly live it. "Nora Adams," he said solemnly, "I've seen more of this country than most men ever will, driven cattle across deserts and mountains, slept under stars from Texas to Montana. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that there is nowhere I'd rather be than right here with you, for as many years as the good Lord grants us." Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Is that a proposal, Matthew Zimmerman?" "It is," he confirmed, squeezing her hands gently. "Though I wish I had a ring to offer you." Nora freed one hand to touch the simple gold band she still wore. With a decisive motion, she slipped it off and placed it in his palm. "This was Thomas's," she said quietly. "He would want it to be used in a promise of happiness, not kept as a relic of grief." Matthew stared at the ring in his hand, humbled by the significance of her gesture. "Are you certain?" "I am," she nodded. "I'll always carry Thomas in my heart but my hand." She extended her left hand, now bare of any adornment. "My hand is ready for a new promise." With emotions threatening to choke his voice, Matthew slid the ring onto his smallest finger for safekeeping. "Then I'll have this resized in town," he said. "And on Sunday, if you're willing, we'll speak our vows before Reverend Thompson and whoever else cares to witness." Nora leaned forward, framing his face with her hands. "I'm willing," she whispered against his lips before kissing him with a passion that left no doubt of her certainty. They were married the following Sunday in Durango's small wooden church, with Sheriff Miller and his wife serving as witnesses. Nora wore a dress of deep blue that brought out the green of her eyes, and Matthew wore the only suit he owned, purchased in Denver years before for a cattle auction he'd attended on behalf of a former employer. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with Reverend Thompson speaking eloquently about second chances and the Lord's mysterious ways. When Matthew slipped the resized gold band onto Nora's finger, now engraved inside with their initials, and the date, he felt a sense of rightness that transcended the solemnity of the occasion. This was where he belonged, with this woman whose strength and tenderness had saved him in ways that went far beyond the bullet she'd removed from his shoulder. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend announced, and Matthew did so with a reverence that brought tears to Mrs. Miller's eyes and a gruff clearing of throat from the sheriff. Their return to the homestead, now truly their home, was accompanied by a snowfall that transformed the landscape into a pristine wonderland. Matthew lifted Nora over the threshold despite her laughing protests, setting her down only when they were fully inside with the door closed against the cold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, still marveling at the reality that this extraordinary woman had chosen to share her life with him. Nora's answering smile held a hint of mischief that quickened his pulse. "I believe tradition calls for a more thorough welcome than that, husband." That night, as the snow continued to fall outside their window, they discovered each other in ways they had only imagined during the months of their careful courtship. Matthew's hands, calloused from years of rope work and manual labor, learned the softness of Nora's skin. Her hands, which had stitched his wound with such precision, now traced patterns of desire across his body with equal skill. In the quiet aftermath, lying tangled together beneath the patchwork quilt, Matthew traced the small scar across Nora's right knuckle that he had noticed during those first days of his recovery. "How did you get this?" he asked, pressing a kiss to the mark. Nora laughed softly. "Trying to separate two chickens that were fighting over feed. One of them objected rather strenuously to my intervention." "Brave woman," he murmured against her skin, "taking on such fearsome opponents." She agreed, her fingers playing idly with his hair. "Nearly as brave as taking in a wounded cowboy who appeared on my doorstep." Matthew raised himself on one elbow to look at her properly, suddenly serious. "Thank you for that," he said. "For letting me in, for healing me, for giving me a reason to stop running." Nora's expression softened with tenderness. "Thank you for staying," she replied simply, "for filling the silence." As winter settled over the Colorado highlands, Matthew and Nora Zimmerman established the rhythms of their shared life. The snowfall that had begun on their wedding day continued intermittently throughout November and December, often leaving them homebound for days at a time. Far from finding this confinement restrictive, they treasured the opportunity to deepen their connection without the distractions of regular work. They spent long evenings reading aloud from Nora's small collection of novels by Dickens and Twain, poetry by Longfellow, a well-worn Bible that had belonged to her parents. Matthew, whose formal education had been limited, discovered a love of literature under Nora's patient guidance. In turn, he taught her to play poker using beans instead of money, at her insistence, and told stories of the characters he'd encountered during his years on the trail. When Christmas approached, Matthew rode into town during a break in the weather to purchase gifts. He returned with a new shawl for Nora, dyed a rich green that matched her eyes, and a selection of seeds for spring planting tomatoes, peppers, and flowers that would brighten the homestead with color. His most treasured find, however, was a small music box discovered in the general store's glass case, imported from back east. When wound, it played a delicate rendition of Beautiful Dreamer that brought tears to Nora's eyes when she first heard it. Her gift to him was equally thoughtful, a handsome leather journal and fountain pen. "For your stories," she explained as he ran his fingers over the supple cover. "They deserve to be preserved." As the new year of 1877 dawned, their discussions increasingly turned to the future. The homestead, while well-maintained, was modest for their growing ambitions. With the money Matthew had saved from years of work and Nora's careful management of their resources, they began planning expansions: a larger kitchen, another bedroom, perhaps eventually a proper second story. "Planning for a family?" Sheriff Miller asked with a knowing smile when Matthew mentioned their building plans during a trip to town for supplies in early March. The question caught Matthew off guard, though it wasn't the first time the thought had crossed his mind. He and Nora hadn't specifically discussed children, but the possibility hung in the air between them, especially when they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom. "Just planning for the future," he answered diplomatically, loading sacks of flour into their wagon. The sheriff chuckled. "Well, spring has a way of bringing new beginnings. Wouldn't be surprised if your plans need to accelerate a bit." Matthew dismissed the comment with a good-natured shrug, but as he drove the wagon home through the muddy roads of early spring, he found himself contemplating the idea more seriously. He had never imagined himself as a father. His own had been a distant, often harsh figure, whose approval Matthew had sought but rarely received. The thought of a child with Nora's green eyes and determined spirit, however, kindled a warmth in his chest that was both terrifying and exhilarating. When he arrived home, he found Nora in the garden plot behind the cabin, turning over the soil in preparation for planting. The sight of her hair tied back with a faded kerchief, sleeves rolled up to expose forearms tanned from outdoor work, hands patting the dark earth with evident satisfaction, struck him anew with the miracle of their shared life. "Thinking of putting in those seeds I bought you for Christmas?" he asked, approaching after he'd unhitched the horses and led them to the corral. Nora looked up with a smile that still had the power to quicken his pulse. "Just preparing the ground. Another few weeks before the danger of frost is past." She stood, brushing soil from her hands. "How was town?" "Same as always," he replied, then hesitated. "Sheriff Miller asked if our building plans meant we were expecting a family." A flush colored Nora's cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. "And what did you tell him?" "That we're just planning for the future." Matthew took her soil-stained hands in his, marveling as always at their strength and capability. "But it got me thinking about what that future might include. Nora's expression softened. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted quietly. "Especially lately." Something in her tone caught Matthew's attention. "Lately," he repeated, studying her face more carefully. The flush on her cheeks deepened and a smile trembled at the corners of her mouth. "I wasn't entirely certain until this week," she said, squeezing his hands. "But I haven't had my monthly courses since January, and I've been feeling different. Tired in the mornings, certain smells suddenly bothersome." Matthew stared at her, his mind struggling to process the implications of her words. "Nora," he breathed, hardly daring to voice the question. "Are you saying?" She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I believe I'm carrying your child, Matthew, our child." For a moment, Matthew couldn't speak, overwhelmed by a surge of emotions too complex to name. Then he was lifting Nora into his arms, spinning her in a circle that made her laugh and clutch his shoulders for balance. "Careful," she protested, though her joy matched his own. "I'm in a delicate condition, or so they say." Matthew set her gently on her feet, then knelt before her, his hands resting reverently on her still flat abdomen. "A baby," he whispered, awestruck. "Our baby." Nora's fingers combed through his hair, her touch infinitely tender. "Are you happy about this?" she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. "It's happening sooner than we planned." Matthew looked up at her, unable to contain the emotions that threatened to burst from his chest. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he said fervently. "Terrified, yes, overwhelmed certainly, but mostly." "Grateful?" He pressed a gentle kiss to her stomach through the fabric of her dress. "Grateful that you found me bleeding on your doorstep. Grateful that you stitched me back together. Grateful that you gave me a reason to stay and now, a future beyond anything I could have imagined." Nora's hands, those beautiful, capable hands that had first captivated him, framed his face, drawing him up to meet her kiss. "We'll build that future together," she promised against his lips. "All three of us." The remainder of spring and early summer was a flurry of activity as they prepared both the homestead and themselves for the child's arrival, expected in late October. Matthew accelerated their building plans, beginning with the expansion of their cabin to include a proper nursery. He hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy work, unwilling to risk Nora's health by attempting the construction alone. Nora, meanwhile, turned her considerable organizational skills to preparing for motherhood. She sewed baby clothes from fabric purchased in Durango, knitted tiny caps and blankets during evening hours, and consulted with Mrs. Miller, whose 4 grown children made her an authority on the subject of childbearing in their small community. As Nora's body changed with the advancing pregnancy, Matthew found himself even more in awe of her strength and resilience. Despite the discomforts, she experienced morning sickness that sometimes lasted all day, swollen ankles in the summer heat, the increasing awkwardness of movement as her belly expanded. She continued to manage their home with the same capable efficiency, adapting her routines to accommodate her changing capabilities. "You should rest more," Matthew urged one August afternoon, finding her in the garden harvesting tomatoes despite the midday heat. Nora straightened with some difficulty, one hand supporting her lower back. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," she reminded him with the stubborn set to her jaw that he both admired and occasionally found exasperating. "Besides, these need to be canned before they spoil." "Then let me help," he insisted, taking the basket from her hands. "That's why you married me, isn't it?" "For my exceptional canning skills." The jest had its intended effect, breaking through her determination with a laugh. "Among other qualities," she conceded, allowing him to guide her to the shade of the porch. "Though I don't recall canning being mentioned in our wedding vows." "It was implied," Matthew assured her solemnly. "In the for better or worse part definitely covers canning." As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the changing colors of the aspen groves that dotted the surrounding hillsides, the nursery was completed and furnished with a cradle Matthew had crafted himself. Painted white with delicate carvings along the rails, it represented weeks of evening work, often continued late into the night after Nora had gone to bed. "It's beautiful," she said when he finally showed her the finished piece, her fingers tracing the carved leaves and flowers that adorned the headboard. "Our little one will sleep like an angel in this, or scream like a banshee," Matthew suggested with a nervous laugh. "I'm told that's equally possible." Nora took his hand, placing it on her rounded belly where their child was performing what felt like acrobatics. "I think this little one is already demonstrating a strong will," she said, wincing slightly as a particularly enthusiastic kick landed near her ribs. "Takes after their father in that regard. Their mother more likely," Matthew countered, marveling as always at the sensation of their child moving beneath his palm. "I've never met a more stubborn woman than you, Nora Zimmerman. Determined," she corrected primly. "The word you're looking for is determined." October arrived with an early snowfall that dusted the mountain peaks and brought a crispness to the air that promised a long winter ahead. Nora, now in her final month of pregnancy, found her energy waning as her body prepared for the imminent birth. She reluctantly accepted Matthew's insistence that she rest more, though she continued to direct household operations from her chair by the fire, where she put the finishing touches on baby clothes and blankets. Dr. Hollister, who served the Durango area from his practice in town, had agreed to attend the birth at their homestead, weather permitting. As a precaution, he supplied them with the necessary medical equipment and gave Matthew basic instructions should the baby arrive during one of Colorado's notorious autumn storms. "I sincerely hope it doesn't come to that," Matthew confessed to Nora after the doctor's visit. "The thought of being responsible if something goes wrong." Nora took his hand, her expression serene despite the anxiety he knew she must also feel. "If it comes to that, we'll manage," she said with characteristic practicality. "After all, I've already performed one successful surgery on you. Bringing our child into the world can't be more complicated than digging a bullet out of your shoulder." Her confidence bolstered his own, as it had so many times since they'd met. "I suppose when you put it that way, it does seem manageable," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But I'd still prefer the doctor handle this particular operation." Fortune favored them in the form of clear weather when Nora's labor began on the morning of October 27th. Matthew rode to town at a gallop to fetch Dr. Hollister, returning to find Nora pacing the cabin floor with determined steps, pausing only when contractions required her full concentration. "You're doing well, Mrs. Zimmerman," Dr. Hollister assured her after his examination. "First babies often take their time, but everything is progressing normally." The doctor's prediction proved accurate as Nora's labor continued throughout the day and into the evening. Matthew remained by her side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, and offering whatever comfort he could as her pain intensified. "I'm sorry," he whispered during a particularly difficult period when her grip on his hand threatened to break bones. "I'm so sorry you're suffering." Nora managed a weak smile between pained breaths. "Not your fault," she gasped. "Well, partially your fault, but I'm not sorry." As midnight approached, Dr. Hollister announced that the time had come for Nora to begin pushing. Matthew positioned himself behind her on the bed, supporting her upper body as she worked to bring their child into the world. The next hour was a blur of encouragement, effort, and pain, culminating in a final push that released their baby into the doctor's waiting hands. "You have a son, Doctor," Hollister announced as the infant's angry cries filled the room. "A fine, healthy boy." Matthew felt tears streaming down his face as the doctor placed the squalling, red-faced newborn on Nora's chest. She was crying too, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she cradled their son with hands that trembled with emotion rather than weakness. "Look what we made, Matthew," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Look at him." Matthew stared at the tiny being they had created together, a perfect miniature person with a shock of dark hair and his mother's determined chin. "He's incredible," he managed, his throat tight with emotion. "You're incredible." After the doctor had completed his work, ensuring that both mother and child were healthy and stable, he departed with promises to return the following day to check on them. Matthew settled into a chair beside the bed where Nora dozed with their son nestled in her arms, unwilling to leave them even for a moment. As dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting their bedroom in soft golden light, Nora stirred and opened her eyes. Her gaze immediately found Matthew, who had maintained his vigil through the night. "You should have slept," she chided gently. "Couldn't," he admitted. "Kept thinking I might wake up and discover this was all a dream." Nora smiled, glancing down at their sleeping son. "Not a dream," she assured him, "though perhaps a miracle." Matthew moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his finger gently tracing the perfect curve of his son's cheek. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but had never settled on a final choice, preferring to wait until they met their child. Now, looking at the tiny face before them, Nora spoke with quiet certainty. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Matthew Zimmerman." Matthew felt a lump form in his throat at her choice, honoring both her first husband and himself in one gesture of remarkable grace. "Are you sure?" Nora nodded, her eyes clear and certain. "Thomas gave me love when I was young and hopeful. He brought me west and helped me build the beginning of this life." Her gaze held Matthew's with unwavering tenderness. "You found me when I thought that life was ending, when I believed love was behind me. You showed me that grief and joy can coexist, that the heart expands rather than replacing one love with another." Matthew leaned forward to kiss her softly, mindful of her exhaustion and the precious bundle between them. "Thomas it is," he agreed. "A good, strong name for a boy who clearly has his mother's determination. And his father's timing," Nora added with a tired smile, "arriving in the middle of the night just like you did." The comparison drew a laugh from Matthew as he recalled his own inauspicious arrival at Nora's door, bleeding and desperate. "Let's hope his life involves fewer bullets than mine has. And more happiness," Nora added, her expression growing serious. "Though I wouldn't change how we found each other, not for anything." In that moment, with the golden light of dawn illuminating the three of them, the family he had never dared to imagine, Matthew felt a completeness that transcended words. From the chaos of violence had come healing, from loneliness had grown connection, from a bullet's destruction had blossomed creation. And it had all begun with a wounded cowboy staring at the hands of a widow as she stitched him back together, one careful suture at a time. The years that followed brought changes to the Zimmerman homestead that reflected the family's growth and prosperity. Thomas grew from a determined infant into a curious toddler, his dark hair and green eyes a perfect blend of his parents' features. His first steps were taken across the cabin floor that had once been stained with his father's blood. His first words were spoken in the kitchen where his mother had prepared countless meals for their expanding household. For the homestead did expand, both in physical structure and in occupants. The spring after Thomas's birth, Matthew completed the second-story addition they had planned, adding 2 more bedrooms and a small sitting area upstairs. The timing proved fortunate, as Nora discovered she was expecting again just as the construction was completed. Sarah Elizabeth Zimmerman arrived in January of 1879, a winter baby born during one of the worst blizzards in Colorado's recorded history. This time, Dr. Hollister could not reach them, and Matthew was forced to rely on the instructions the doctor had given him months before, along with Nora's own remarkable composure under pressure. "You've done this before," she reminded him through gritted teeth as her contractions intensified. Just from the other side of the equation. The birth was mercifully quicker than Thomas's had been, and when Matthew placed their daughter in Nora's arms less than 6 hours after labor began, the pride and relief on his wife's face mirrored his own overwhelming emotions. "She's perfect," Nora whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes with the same methodical attention she gave to all important tasks. And you, Matthew Zimmerman, have just added midwifery to your list of unexpected skills. Matthew laughed shakily, the tension of the preceding hours finally releasing its grip on him. "Let's hope it's not a skill I need to employ regularly," he said, collapsing onto the bed beside them. "My nerves couldn't take it, but Sarah would not be their last child." 2 years later, Nora gave birth to twin boys James and Joseph, this time with Dr. Hollister in attendance, for which Matthew was profoundly grateful. The arrival of 2 babies instead of the expected one necessitated further expansion of their home and operations. By 1882, the original modest cabin had been transformed into a proper ranch house, with a large kitchen, formal parlor, and enough bedrooms to accommodate their growing family. The surrounding land, initially just 20 acres, had been expanded to nearly 200, as Matthew purchased adjacent parcels from neighbors who decided to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The Z-Bar Ranch, as it came to be known, a brand designed by Thomas when he was 5, consisting of a simple Z with a horizontal bar through it, developed a reputation throughout the territory for the quality of its cattle and horses. Matthew's years on the trail had given him a keen eye for good stock, and under his management, their herds flourished. Nora, meanwhile, continued to be the heart of their operation, managing the household with the same efficiency she had shown when it was just the 2 of them. She taught Thomas his letters and numbers until he was old enough to attend the schoolhouse in Durango, tended to Sarah's delicate health during the girl's frequent childhood illnesses, and somehow managed to keep the rambunctious twins from destroying life and property with their endless energy. Through it all, through the expansions and births and growth of their ranch, Matthew never lost his fascination with Nora's hands. He watched them rock cradles, knead bread dough, mend torn clothing, and occasionally still stitch up minor wounds, though thankfully none as serious as the one that had first brought them together. He held them during the births of their children, during the funeral of her father who came to live with them in his final years, during quiet moments when words seemed inadequate for the life they had built together. And on the rare occasions when they found themselves alone when children were asleep or visiting friends in town, he would take those beloved hands in his and press kisses to each finger, each palm, each wrist, as reverently as he had on their wedding night. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked one such evening as they sat on the porch swing he had built for her 40th birthday, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Matthew smiled, lifting her right hand to examine the small chicken-induced scar that had intrigued him so many years before. "I was thinking about how these hands have shaped my life," he admitted, "how they saved me in more ways than one." Nora's expression softened with understanding. 20 years of marriage had given her an almost preternatural ability to follow his thoughts, even when they wandered into sentimental territory that his younger self would have avoided at all costs. "I was so afraid that day," she confessed, surprising him. They had spoken of their first meeting many times, but she had never admitted fear. "When you fell through my door, bleeding and unconscious, my first thought was that I couldn't possibly help you, that you would die despite my efforts, and I would have to live with that failure." Matthew squeezed her hand gently. "What changed your mind?" "Nothing changed it," Nora said simply. "I was terrified the entire time I was digging that bullet out, afraid with every stitch that I was doing more harm than good, but the alternative, doing nothing, was unthinkable." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Matthew quoted, remembering something he'd read in one of the books they'd shared during that first winter together. "It's acting despite it." Nora nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. "I've never regretted it," she said softly, "opening that door, taking that chance." "Nor have I," Matthew replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and drawing her closer. "Every day since has been a gift I never expected to receive." From inside the house came the sound of their children's voices. Thomas, now 16 and showing signs of the man he would become. Sarah, 14 and already displaying her mother's practical intelligence. The twins, 12, and still capable of creating chaos from the most ordered situation. Their voices rose and fell in the familiar pattern of sibling interaction, part argument, part conversation, wholly alive. Matthew and Nora exchanged a smile that contained volumes, shared memories, private jokes, hardships overcome, joys celebrated, the entire history of a love that had begun with a bullet and a needle. "Should we go in and referee?" Matthew asked, though he made no move to rise from the swing. Nora shook her head, settling more comfortably against him. "They'll sort it out," she said confidently. "We've taught them well." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Matthew reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. From a wounded cowboy with no home and no future beyond the next trail, he had become a husband, a father, a rancher with deep roots in this Colorado soil. And it had all begun with a desperate knock on a cabin door, with a widow who had found the courage to open it, with hands that had stitched together not just torn flesh, but two broken hearts. "I love you, Nora Zimmerman," he said, the words no less heartfelt for having been spoken thousands of times over the years. Nora's hands found his in the gathering darkness, fingers intertwining with the familiarity of long practice. "And I love you, Matthew Zimmerman," she replied. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days that follow." The promise hung in the air between them, as solid and enduring as the mountains that cradled their home, as the ranch they had built together, as the family they had created from the most unlikely of beginnings. It was a promise first made when a wounded cowboy let a widow stitch his shoulder while he stared at her hands, and it was a promise they would keep until their final breaths.